Looks like we're live.
We are live. Well, we are here with Jess Walker, the book's editor of recent matter of United States of Paranoia. This is the first episode of Late Night Anarchy, which I hope will be a new interesting podcast. And first of all, I want to know, and I think many of the people who read your columns want to know how you became a libertarian.
How I became a libertarian? Well, I have different versions of this story I tell people, because always, when you look back at your developing years, you can always organize it in different ways. The fact is, I do remember as a Cub Scout, there was a requirement that, to get one of the badges that say you write why you need laws. I remember rebelling against having to write that essay. But my parents were both liberal Democrats, and I kind of followed that. And then I moved leftward as I grew older and hit my teens, which in practice meant that I was against, very sort of militantly against war and conscription and censorship and bigotry and so on, and suspicious of corporate elites and so on. And those attitudes didn't really change as I became libertarian. I mean, the easy thing to say would be that I read some economics and that changed my thinking, but changed my underlying values. But another way to look at it in retrospect, because this was the 1980s, and the New Left was over. But for some reason, I was interested in the New Left. I was just interested in the 60s and the 70s as historical periods. And I had this kind of sympathy with the protesters, at least initially, as I was reading about it. They're against the Vietnam War. They're for Black Power. They seem like the right sides of the issues to me. And I guess I could look at my teens as looking at one sort of New Left variant after another and considering it until I got to the libertarians who were engaged with the New Left. Like, I found stuff that Rothbard and Hess and all them had written. And while my politics have in various ways changed since I was 17 and reading Jerome Giuccioli's books and Karl Hess's books and so on, and some libertarian books that don't fit under that rubric, like David Friedman and Milton Friedman. I mean, that really was actually what kind of opened the door for me to even considering libertarianism, seeing it in that context of these guys trying to engage the decentralist left, which I was a part of, and making economic arguments that seemed more ultimately plausible and consistent to me than the stuff I'd been sort of picking up willy-nilly from other sources, reading Mother Jones and The Nation and all those other magazines I was reading back then. And still am reading, but through different eyes 30 years later. So yeah, I guess I became a libertarian at some point.
But well, I guess that all have a strange story of how they become libertarians, and I guess mine is quite strange in some ways, because I became a libertarian when I was a member of the Socialist Party. Curiously enough, I'm still a member, even if my politics have changed very much, because I think that thing about Lewis that is descendant about another party was called a Mariátegui party, which was a guy which was more or less a Marxist, but a very anarchist strain, and the guy. And some people in the Socialist Party are much more closer to anarchism in reality than social democracy or Marx and socialism. But the funny thing was that for some reason was reading a blog about an Argentinian professor of philosophy that basically worked with continental philosophy, but somehow the guy was a fan of Reason magazine, and he sometimes put things about Reason, but I didn't read Reason at the time. But when he put an article about Karl Hess, I was in Karl Hess, and when I become more interested in Karl Hess, I read the death of politics, and basically that converted me to libertarianism. And then I started to see the podcast of Lucy and Keaton, like attacking the state and war. And I guess that I was more or less, I think that strangely enough, the reason why I became someone of the left is because I am anti-war. I mean, I am anti-war against the wars here in Peru, but also against the presence of U.S. troops there are 3 bases in here where U.S. troops have presence. And when initially I consider myself more or less of socialist, and to a certain point I am still are, but because of Lucy and because of Angela Keaton, I am more close to some forms of anarchism. I guess that because of the influence of Justin Raimondo and Bill Kaufman and Daniel McCarthy, I also don't sometimes call myself a left-wing paleo-libertarian because, for example, I think support borders, but as I have seen the experience, for example, in Argentina, that there is still a lot of racism. They have been racist attacks against immigrants, despite that the country has open borders. So for me, open borders, despite that is a good idea that I support, is still not the answer. I mean, the answer for me will be abolish the states and the communities that want to receive immigrants that should receive them, not shouldn't be forced to do it.
Your signal broke up slightly there. You said after open borders was not the answer. You said the answer was, and then I didn't catch what you said.
The answer was more or less anarchism. So that communities could choose whether to receive immigrants or not. I think that was more or less the answer of Karl Hess, which was curiously enough one of the only people that I could call in some sense a left-wing paleo-libertarian, because he sounded, I mean, I like the people of the C4SS. I think they publish some interesting things, but sometimes they don't realize that Karl Hess and even Karl Lesby to a certain extent were fairly more than.
Or fairly what? I'm sorry.
I mean, in some no, that the people in C4SS, despite that I agree with them on several issues, I think sometimes are not that aware that Karl Hess and Karl Lesby in some certain ways were fairly more conservative than them.
Well, I mean, Karl Hess at different points in his career was more or less. I mean, in the 60s, well, the late 60s and 70s. I mean, and even he was a hippie, you know, not just a new left guy. I mean, he was a hippie living on a houseboat, smoking pot, and you know, and then later on, I'm sorry, there's like a temper tantrum going on up the stairs from me, and it's 5-year-old going to bed, and that's distracting me. So, and then he drifts back to the right in the 1980s. But I mean, he sees, and you can really contrast the stuff he was writing when he was hanging out with Charles Murray around 1987, 88, 89, with the stuff he was writing when he was going through the Institute for Policy Studies and Institute for Local Self-Reliance in the 70s. And there was something of a culture clash between him and the left-wing neighborhood power people in the 70s. Some conflict about, I mean, although Karl Hess had, actually done like some ghostwriting for the Black Panthers and so on, he had some different views on the right approach to some civil rights issues than some of the people on the left, the white left that he was working with. And that sort of would come up. And at the same time, by the same token, by the time he's hanging out with, again, folks like Charles Murray, and he was editing. Well, that's another part of his career. At the end of his career, he's gone back to the right in a lot of ways, but he's still against workplace hierarchy. And I can remember seeing a fax he sent to Bill Bradford near the end of his life when I was working for Liberty, where he was saying this was like one of the reasons Murray Rothbard didn't like him was because he was interested in these ideas about sanding down the hierarchy between the boss and the worker, and having a more I don't think he'd use the word egalitarian, but a more autonomy and self-direction and self-ownership in the workforce. So so he never gave up that sort of IWW side of his ideas, even as he came back to using the word capitalism and things like that. So it's very complicated. I had this idea for doing not long ago for doing a biography of him, and that kind of got backburnered, and I don't know if I'm ever going to write it, but it's very complicated. He also got really interested towards the end of his life in cyberpunk stuff, and was looking at not just cyberpunk fiction, but like the sort of whole emerging ideas before everyone was on the internet, of stuff that people like Timothy Leary were talking about, of a sort of cyber, sort of a more libertarian spin on the whole call for a third wave idea, and connecting this with computers and communication online. And that, again, was part of his interest in sort of empowering individuals, liberating them from all kinds of institutions, not just that which calls itself the state. So again, this is very roundabout. So it's even at his sort of right-wing period, he's got all these left-wing impulses, and even in his left-wing period, he's got some right-wing impulses, or perceived as right-wing impulses. I mean, in the early 70s, he's flirting with Mao. Or if not with Mao per se, Stephen Holbrook wrote this article for Option magazine, which is a now long-defunct libertarian magazine called Mao, Economy and State, which was this pretty absurd attempt to read Maoist China as a libertarian experiment. And because, I mean, it was not a very, I actually have a copy of this now. I should post this online so people can see it and experience it for themselves. It is, Stephen Holbrook was trying to claim everyone on the left for libertarianism, and this was kind of the low point of that. But they got Karl Hess to write an introduction for it, which was sort of like well, guys, let's take a look at these claims one by one. If something is interesting happening in China, we can learn from it. We should find out. And I think Karl Hess was the only other person I can think of who sort of went along with some of Holbrook's claims was, of all people, Leonard Liggio, who was a crony of Murray Rothbard's and later a head of the Pellerin Society, and a very buttoned-down libertarian type, and not someone you would expect to see saying kind words about Mao and Lenin, but he got kind of caught up in it too. I think I answered your question and then some with that. So sorry, go on to your next query.
No, I think you have a great idea. I mean, writing a biography about Karl Hess will be very interesting. I think a lot of people in the left should know about him. Last year I presented a paper about basically the new left and the conversion between the new left and libertarianism. In theory, there were three panelists. We were three panelists, and it will be like an hour, and we will have only 20 minutes. But the other two panelists didn't go because the panel was about political theory, and I basically spoke about the new left and libertarianism for 1 hour, and people were very surprised that
I lost you for a moment there. I didn't hear what you said after you said you spoke about it for an hour, and then people were and then I missed what the reaction was.
Yeah, I mean, people were surprised because, I mean, people in Latin America know very few things for the point. But funny enough, the professor, which was, I mean, is an anthropologist of political science. I mean, she did her undergraduate in anthropology, and her graduate studies in political science was very interesting because she first not much works during in Peru. Political science much like in Latin America in general is like public policy and things like that, and there are very few people that have written about anarchism, and she was very interested in that, and rethinking the market, not as as a as a rigid, but as something very like as something more complex. Because, and it was, I think there is a possibility about, I think I made the comment, and with in some of the posts of the C4SS, or someone of the C4SS, I say that SS is for real. They should, their time in an SPL conference, they should go to the left forum. I mean, it's for real, because I think that it's their goal. If they want to reach the left that agrees with them on the issues, I think, but not in the way they should try to convince them.
Have you had much engagement with sometimes called the autonomist Latin American left? I don't know if that's even a term that's really in use down there, but
well, I mean, I sometimes listen about them. I mean, but the real thing is very complicated. I mean, sometimes they refer the autonomist left. There are people even that consider that some form of chatting is left, and I look, I know that in Peru there are a lot of parties, and that a lot of parties call for quote unquote people's power, but actually most of them are sadly very bureaucratic. That's what I have been critical of several parties. But since the Socialist Party electoral of all the profit, but it usually don't run candidates for president or something like that. This is, and so that allows me to criticize the presidential candidates and things like that. But I think that there are interesting things. I mean, Sivechi, which you quoted in your article about El Alto, there are a lot of internet, and he talks about some communities in Colombia, some communities in Bolivia, the immigrants, Bolivian immigrants in Argentina that have formed their own form of communities. There are some, well, the Zapatistas are the most. As someone from Latin America, when I hear the autonomous left, on the one hand, I am happy to hear about them, but on the other hand, I know that there are a lot of people that have somehow socialist libertarian rhetoric, but in the practice are very bureaucratic.
I mean, like, what about, say, the landless workers movement in Brazil? Gets mentioned up here in connection with them a lot.
The no lands movement, about the people that don't have land.
Yeah, the people who do the land occupations in Brazil.
Oh yeah, they are interesting. I think they have some sort of relationship with the Workers' Party, and that is the situation that concerns me, because I mean, a lot of libertarians are against Dilma Rousseff, and I think that in fact the Workers' Party, but actually the house of Dilma is not helping Brazil, because as far as I know, Dilma wasn't itself corrupt. I mean, the Workers' Party was corrupt, but in the case of Temer himself, so he's corrupt according to the investigation. I mean, opposing the left is necessarily good. I mean, I oppose the left when I have to. I mean, I am one of the few pro-gun rights in the Latin American left, I guess, because the sad part is that most people so especially the professors of international relations here in Latin America are quite liberal in the sense of they all when they are shooting they call for gun control and things like that. But I think that I don't know. I mean, back to Latin America, there are some interesting things in what the problem was that Evo Morales or Correa were like left-wing populists in some way more than socialists. Even Marxists say that they are not really socialists; that they are left-wing neoliberals in some sense. And while I don't like that, I think there should. In 52, with the Bolivian Revolution, if the anarchists would have had a strong presence and would have rejected the more nationalist force, they could have maybe have a better deal with make some sort of alliance with the Trotskyists, because in Bolivia the Trotsky left is very Trotsky leader, which is very famous.
I lost your signal again. You said the Trotskyist left is very white in Bolivia?
It's very large. There have a lot of Trotsky groups, and they actually don't like Evo Morales. They think he is in constitution that allows that they creates 40 nationalities, and they attack him for that. But also it's funny because sometimes Trotskyists sound like anarchists, and for example, one of the leaders said that the goal of the Trotsky left should be not take the power, but actually, so yeah, I mean, it's very funny and refreshing sometimes to listen to the Trotskyists of some, especially of some countries. And actually, I don't know if you know that, but Keshama Sawan, the Socialist Council member of Seattle, win by a very tiny margin in her original election against she actually the Black Rose movement. I think that we're an anarchist collective, and it was very funny the ideas that they have about Keshama Sawan, but I think that yeah, sometimes anarchists and Trotskyists especially have a very good but now he sounds also very anarchist, and I am a huge fan of him, because he sounds really like an anti-authoritarian guy. I mean, he has been very critical of even left-wing governments, which is not necessarily that common in left-wing leaders, because
I missed. Are you there?
Yes.
Yes, I'm sorry. The Trotskyists in America, you kind of want to run screening from. They're these very like tiny cults that show up and sell their newspapers, and they want to make themselves look bigger than they are. So like the same four people will put themselves in different parts of the crowd, start asking the same question or whatever at the same time, and it's transparent what they're doing. I read Trotsky, in my teens. I mentioned me reading around when I was sort of looking at the different alternatives. And the first I heard of Trotsky, I thought, oh, he didn't like Stalin. I'll take a look at him. So I don't like Stalin. Maybe this is, and I'm looking for some sort of radical alternative that would not make you end up looking like the USSR. And then you look at Trotskyism itself then turns out to be, oh, the USSR is a bureaucratically deformed worker state, but it's a worker state and we must defend it. And it really becomes this, it really becomes this kind of unpleasant ideology. There are some people I like who went through Trotskyist phases, like Dwight McDonald, C.L.R. James, Ken McLeod, currently. But Trotskyism itself and Trotsky himself, it's funny to hear you mentioning anarchists and Trotskyists getting along in Latin America, because I think most anarchists up here would think of Kronstadt first when they following Leon Trotsky. But I mean, it could be a local variation.
Well, I think that probably Trotskyists and anarchists have some sort of different vision about racial relationships in Latin America. I guess that they don't have necessity of nationality. Well, I mean the variant of Trotskyism and the variant of anarchism. But I think that it could play in different ways. I don't know if you have, by the way, you have read that the Green Party has adopted an anti-capitalist plank. So
anti-what dependent?
Officially, did you hear the Green Party has adopted an anti-capitalist plank? So now the Green Party is officially an anti-capitalist party.
Yeah, well, that's Murray Bookchin is jumping up and down in his grave, I guess. Yeah, and they're also proposing the Green New Deal and so on, which I guess might rub shoulders uneasily with green anti-capitalism. But
yes, that sounds absurd.
Yeah, I don't know. I should have watched their convention on C-SPAN if it was on C-SPAN last weekend. I was just tied up with other stuff, so I didn't pay close attention. I didn't know they had adopted that plank. Although I did see Jill Stein got the nomination, and everyone has been dropping all their opposition research on her for the last week and a half. It was funny, actually. They were dropping all those stories about her a week ago. I'm changing the subject. I'm sorry. Like they had that anti-vaccine thing, which turned out to be kind of a BS story, that like she wasn't anti-vaccine. And then they found someone dug up an old a comment she had made on a video, like in March or something, about possible dangers of wireless devices. And now they're going after her for being on this RT thing. But it was funny that they were dropping all this before she was nominated, and it was like, you should wait and see if you're going after the right. Assuming this is ultimately coming from pro-Clinton people. But then it occurred to me, wouldn't it be funny if this was one of the minor Green candidates trying to do all their opposition research to have
it would have been funny. I mean,
I don't even remember who the other candidates running were. But I don't think they were into the advanced media manipulation and dirty tricks level of campaigning where they actually have opposition.
Yes, I think the funny part is that no. What I think is that the funny part is that the Green Party platform somehow sounds a little bit like you were thinking that they could be libertarian socialists because they say that they are also against state socialism.
Yeah.
But
well, I remember seeing their original principles of. I should say the first thing I ever read about the Greens, like long thing that wasn't like some super superficial newspaper article, was the book Green Politics by Fritjof Capra, and I forget his co-author's name. It came out in the early 80s, I think, and they were really stressing the sort of beyond left and right quality of the Greens. They would always stress whenever a former Christian Democrat joined them and so on. And they went out of their way to have people like John McClowery blurbing it, or at least they had John McClowery blurbing it. And I think he was either still in or just out of the Reagan White House then. So between that and knowing that one of their, and knowing that there was this anarchist current in the Greens, the Bookchinites in the 80s, and also knowing just that one of their planks was nonviolence, which, you know, suggests anti-statism, although not everyone reads it that way. I've always sort of expected, or I for a long time expected to see sort of an anti-authoritarian left current within the Greens, and that was there. Not really my particular style of it, but I could, you know, recognize some commonalities. That's really not been in the post-Nader era, at least. Ralph Nader is kind of complicated politically, more so than people give him credit for. The party itself, more and more, just seemed to be like we are to the left of the standard Democratic Party. You know, we are the people who are a bit to the left of the George McGoverns, even, you know, something similar to, like, you know, Benjamin Spock in the People's Party, Barry Commoner in the Citizens Party, which had some Green connections in the 80s. So it's not out of the blue, but it's a bit different than, you know, that other side of the Green movement that I remember seeing when I was first reading about them, you know, 30-something years ago.
Well, I think that there is in this race a very interesting candidate in upstate New York. His name is Matt Finicello. He's a baker, and he's a very strong supporter of gun rights. I mean, not the thing that you will think when you heard about a Green Party congressional candidate. He's running a very interesting campaign for what I have seen, and he's running against a Republican which worked for, which is the current congressman, and a former military man, which was formerly a registered Republican, and only since this year he has switched to Democrat, and so he's the only relatively progressive in the race. But if I am not wrong, I mean, this is a very curious kind of Green. I mean, he sounds much like Nader in some sense, because and the funny thing is, I don't know if you know Howie Hawkins.
I know who he is. I never met him, but yeah.
He was, I mean, as far as I know, he was like the part of the left wing of the Green Party. And he, at some times, was relatively close to Bush, despite that he was someone that considered himself more or less a socialist. No? Mm-hmm. But Howie forward, there was the division between the Naderites and the more liberal wing, which wanted to play the safe strategy, become more close to Nader, because despite that he was for Nader, he had some disagreements with the campaign, which was much more directed by the liberal wing of the party. Actually, no, they were looking for another. They didn't want a convention. Actually, they want another type of organization, because the convention and the politics like now we see in the Green Party are part of doing what the big parties do, and so the better win of the Greens, as far as I know, the work in the G. Jackson campaign and in the Jerry Brown campaign. So they were like very happy about the convention, because they like that kind of things. But the other part was that things should be more grassroots, that members should be it sounds very that how he supports. It's that the state shouldn't have anything to do with a political party. The political party should be completely autonomous for taking decisions. And he also, Howie Hawkins, is a pro-gun rights green, and the funny part is that he's also a Marine. I mean, he wasn't anti-war. I mean, he's anti-war, but when he preferred not to be drafted, and he voluntarily joined the Marine in the 70s, but he was lucky to not be sent to Vietnam, but he was a Marine, and he's a very interesting guy. I mean, he get scholarships, an athletics scholarship at Dartmouth, but he works as a teamster, but is kind of the folk hero of the Green Party, because his knowledge about everything. I mean, if you see one of his videos in the internet, I mean, he's a very expert on political history, and well, he was first in the Peace and Freedom Party, then in the People's Party, then in the Citizens Party. He has been in all the transformations. He even did a launch, actually, but it was an attempt in the 90s to organize a third-party opposition to which was considered the neoliberal term about the Clinton, which led me to the next question, which is kind of, because Vox is a that sometimes is for some at least is in part neoliberal, has some libertarians or people or libertarians in some ways writing now there for them. What do you think about that?
Are for whom? I'm sorry.
I mean, Vox, the publication now has some libertarians which are writing for them.
I'm still missing who is. I'm sorry. I missed the word in there.
Yeah, well, that Vox, that the publication is hiding. No, I don't know if hiding, but it's publishing some libertarians.
And I'm sorry. What publication? I'm embarrassed. I'm not.
Vox.
How do you spell?
Vox.
Both.
Vox.
Oh, books.
Which is, yes, which is of a New York Times guy, which is more or less a neoliberal in some sense, I guess. But I don't know. It was very funny because I think that the has shown that neither was do good for running as a third party, because I mean, neither would have get much less than Bernie do. I mean, Nader was painted as an anti-Semite actually, but by Krugman, even before that he ran for president. I think that sometimes is like a myth that Nader was a liberal icon. Actually, a lot of the people in the Clinton administration, especially, were much more market friendly than Nader. I mean, market friendly is not probably the term. We're actually much more corporatist than Nader, and actually some of them really hate Nader. I mean,
Nader's politics are really complicated, and for a long time I wrote him off as just, you know, the guy who pushed through all those regulations in the 60s. Although I was aware that he had also pushed through in the 70s. But I knew that was just sort of part of the liberal gestalt at the time, people realizing that you know, airline deregulation and so on could bust up some old cartels. But he's got this, and I was also aware that he had written an early piece for the Freeman. I didn't realize until someone started, you know, dumping Oppo on him back in, I guess, around 2000, that must have been, that before he did his piece in the Freeman, he did the piece in the American Mercury, which, I mean, actually, it was before the American Mercury had veered to like the disgusting ultra-right. I mean, like Willis Carto bought it in the late 60s. But it was actually after it was bought by someone who was an anti-Semite, and I'm not smearing Nader as an anti-Semite. Actually, for a bit under him and had this sort of crisis of conscience and left after he realized, you know, that his son boss was obsessed with world Jewry and so on. But my point is that, I mean, they still did continue to run some, you know, respectable conservative voices in the 50s and early 60s before they veered way off into cloud cuckoo land. But my point is that, so I knew Nader had these kind of early associations with the right and libertarians, although he wasn't really of those places. And I knew that he had been a part of deregulation, but even so, I didn't really, and I knew he was interested in left-right cooperation on things like congressional pay raises, but I mean sort of process issues. But it wasn't really until his presidential campaigns began that I saw that he had like something of a although he's from Connecticut, something of a throwback to the sort of Midwestern style of progressivism, which was still ultimately a statist movement, but also had this sort of suspicion of elites as very different from the coastal progressives, and had this sort of suspicion of sometimes a suspicion between state and corporate power cooperating, you know, as when Robert La Follette Sr. voted against the creation of the Federal Reserve, and had this anti-war side and so on. And when I saw Ralph Nader doing more left-right stuff, I mean, reaching out even to people like Pat Buchanan, I realized that you know, he was reaching towards something that was a bit more than I understood that I initially understood him to have as his politics. And I actually asked him once. I was at a conference with him, and I asked him when he started associating himself, thinking of himself as part of the left, and he said, "I never started thinking of myself as part of the left." I think he is ultimately a part of the left, and I think he's, well, for all that he reaches for, there's a lot of things he doesn't always pass the ideological Turing test. He doesn't always realize why either a libertarian or a conservative that he's reaching out to might not agree with him on a particular issue, or might not come at it quite from the angle that he's expecting. But he does have that kind of old style progressive, small r Republican side to him that is pretty rare among sort of mainline left people these days. I mean, it's not like the Barry Commoner Greens, and it's not like the Murray Bookchin Greens either. And I don't know that it really fully came, I was going to say it didn't really fully come shining through for Nader until he joined the Greens. But first, he didn't join the Greens. He ran as their candidate twice, but refused to join the party. And then after they didn't renominate him in 2004, he kept running as an independent. So the Greens were kind of a way station for him. But in many ways, when you look at the old sort of Reform Party coalition, Ralph Nader was kind of the missing left end of that. Instead, they got Minora Fulani, who didn't belong there. And then Ralph Nader was sort of a more natural fit with that kind of coalition. And ultimately, of course, I think 2004 got the presidential endorsement of the remnants of the Reform Party. Yeah, it was 2004 because
yes.
The candidate was from Perot in '96 to Buchanan to Nader, which seems like a really bizarre hopscotch. So if you try to think what do those three have in common, you start to understand that '90s Reform Party politics, I guess, on some underlying level.
Which was make me back to the 90s. I mean, now everything is back to the 90s, but the 90s were a very interesting time for politics in America, because I think people were searching for new alternatives. I mean, Jerry Brown also is someone which had a very particular kind of politics.
Yeah,
and he was a
and his politics in the '90s were not the same as they are now. I was for Jerry Brown in '92. I didn't vote for him because I've never voted in a primary, and I guess in '92 it was because I was out of town when Michigan had its primary. But that was one of the few times I was tempted to vote in a presidential primary. I was 21, I guess, and I was a libertarian at that point. And Jerry Brown was seemed to be challenging Bill Clinton from the left and the right at the same time. He was talking about flat tax, term limits, abolishing the Department of Education. I didn't agree with all of it. I mean, I didn't like his value-added tax, but I mean, the very idea that he was looking at that sort of suggested that he was breaking free of sort of the standard liberal nostrums. And at the same time, he was the one person who rebelled against, in the first or second Democratic debate that campaign, this sort of crime fear-mongering question, and gave this impromptu and very eloquent lecture about the way fear-mongering fears a loss of liberty. And I'm not a huge fan of what Jerry Brown is doing these days, and I didn't really entirely trust him back then either, even though I was sort of responding to what he was doing politically, in the sense of thinking this is the only person in the presidential race who's even coming close to or at least in the primary phase of the presidential race, who's even coming close to saying a set of ideas that I like. But yeah, he was interesting. A few years after that, I mean, then he left the Democratic Party. People forget this. He exited the Democratic Party after the '92 campaign, got elected mayor of Oakland as an independent, and didn't rejoin until around 2000, I think. And then he was living in a commune, doing a show on Pacifica and interviewing Noam Chomsky for Spin magazine, and really seemed to be moving in this interesting direction, which now he's governor of California again. But he's just a fast. I actually think, and this is, I'm looking at his whole career now, and all the stuff I disagree with Jerry Brown as well as agree with. I think he is one of the two most fascinating major figures in American politics in the last half century. The other one being a person who I'm not a fan of at all, which is George Wallace, but who's also extremely interesting. And I think that if you look at the career of Jerry Brown and at the career of George Wallace, you find all sorts of interstices in American politics that the familiar categories of left and right sometimes usually leave out.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not necessarily that much of an expert in Jerry Brown, but I think he sounded more. The other candidate which sounded very curious was Mike Gravel, because on the one hand he said that he was a FDR Democrat, but on the other hand he has very. I think, well, to be fair, I think FDR was a capitalist. I mean, even some socialists are embracing FDR capitalists, and I think that he was pressed by some part of the left to make some of the reforms, but actually, I don't think that he was ideologically a social democrat or a progressive in the sense that sometimes is tried to be portrayed. So I guess that Mike Gravel represents some sort of, and I agree to a certain point that JFK was probably even ideologically much more free market than probably even Hillary, despite that. I think that sometimes it's missed that link. I think that the New Deal is less and more than it was. I think it was a particular time, but
there are different New Deals. I was actually you and I were both in that Facebook conversation recently. because I mean, historians talk about the first New Deal and the second New Deal, and of course there are always other ideas that were sort of floating around and reforms getting tried out that don't even fit into those two categories. But the first New Deal being sort of represented by the National Recovery Act and that very centralized corporatist, semi-fascist approach. And then the second New Deal, he's responding to pressure from the left, you know, from the threat of, well, I mean, I can't do it wrong in Norman Thomas, even someone like Alfred Murray, and at that point, I mean, a number of things happened there. I mean, the first New Deal is very, I'm assuming, leaving aside the stuff that Joel was bringing up in that discussion about homesteads and all, it was a very monopolist position, sort of big government and big business and labor unions, sort of a divvy up sort of economy. And deal. You'll sometimes hear people saying that's when they turned anti-monopolist. Actually, I would say you had pro and anti-monopolist forces within the administration having a tug of war with each other. In addition to the other reforms that were going on, like Social Security. What one leaves out is that World War II era economic policy is a complete reversion to corporatism and centralism. I mean, if you were to call that a third New Deal, and I don't know if anyone ever does, I mean, that is, a complete reversion to the idea of large businesses being subsidized and protected by the state, and labor unions being used as a means of disciplining workers, and a whole general sense of regimentation and centralization. And of course, it's not being done in the name of reform. It's being done in the name of war production and winning the war. And which is why people don't conceptually put it in the same space as that. But it really is a return to that early corporatism, only without the sort of sheen of idealism. I mean, you also have like the seeds of the post-war planted that. And there's a great book called Radio Goes to War, which talks about that in the radio context and sort of the change in the way the role the advertising played over the course of the early 40s in American broadcasting. There you can see parallels to that in other parts of the economy too. So it's really easy to generalize about the New Deal, and then people have this idealized sense of the New Deal. So you have people like Mike Gravel, you mentioned. Fred Harris would be another one from Oklahoma. Very fascinating political figure in the, it's a really fascinating period of time is in the 70s, but not just then. Who will, on the one hand, be calling back to FDR times, but on the other hand, having this sort of post-New Left idea of decentralization and distrust of the regulatory agencies, and an interest in at least, I don't know if you call it market reform, but some apparatus in the same way that actually people like Nader were doing. And they were putting out books like the Monopoly Makers and pushing for things like airline and trucking deregulation. So Mike Gravel, of course, ended up in the Libertarian Party. I don't know if he's still a member of the LP. But after he didn't get the Democratic nomination in 2008, he tried for the Green nomination, I think, and then he definitely tried for the Libertarian nomination. And I got a soft spot for him just because when I was a teenager reading all those different political ideologies, I picked up like an early edition of his book Citizen Power, which he keeps revising. It's like some 4th or 5th edition now. This was the first edition, and it was early 70s, young, idealistic young liberal talking about ways to devolve power to the people in a way that, I was already turning towards libertarianism at this point, but I could sort of see him as a liberal that I had something in common with. So I guess I wasn't all that surprised that of all the 70s liberals that I was taking a look at, he was the one that ultimately ended up in the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, the sad thing was that he didn't get the nomination, and Bob Barr get the nomination, was an authoritarian guy.
Yeah, it would have been interesting if Gravel. I don't think he was interested in the vice presidential nomination, but a Barr Gravel right and left unity ticket would have been a really beast that had been run that year.
Well, I think
Barr
I have
sense.
an interesting story. I mean, I was in there was an IMF meeting here in Peru, and I was in the protest against against the TPP, and like, well, my opposition to the TPP is more or less Rothbardian, but since the left was protesting, I was more or less with the left. And the funny thing was that the protests, I mean, out of nothing, they appear some, I don't know in English how they call it. I mean, ambulance sellers, food sellers, and they were selling. Well, here in Peru there is a large Chinese community, so they were, and I was thinking that that is the spontaneous order of the market. I mean, that was what a truly free market should look like, not a very regulatory and um, like it's going to happen with TPP, because TPP is going to enact a lot of laws that actually are going to make a lot of things very a lot of things more expensive, which is not what a free trade agreement in theory should be like.
Yeah, they've got the intellectual property provisions in there, which are not free trade oriented at all. But yeah, so we're getting up towards 10. Was there anything you wanted to make sure we squeezed in before for the hour wrapped up?
Oh, well, it was. Uh, I think we have talked about different things, but back to the cultural stuff about the 90s. I think that the 90s were a very interesting period. As someone who lived in Latin America, I mean, in Latin America, there were a lot of interesting alternative channels, which were very interesting. They did a lot of things about New Age, about they even put some animes, some alternative American shows like Dagman. I was a huge fan of Dagman, or this other show. I don't
Like the Adam West Batman?
Dagman was a dag which talked. It was an used cable channel, and it was very interesting things. And the MTV in the 90s in Latin America was very interesting because it was very broad. I think that um, it was an interesting time, I think, and I'm happy that the 90s are coming back. Not only the more mainstream stuff like Independence Day or the X Files, but also some of the indie bands of the 90s are going back and making reunions. There is Slow Dive, which is a showgaze band from the 90s that is making a reunion, and I was seeing a concert of them, and the stadium is.
Which band
Huh?
did you play? Which band did you
Slow Dive.
Okay.
Slow Dive.
Okay.
Do you have heard?
I don't think I have, no.
No, they are very interesting. I mean, Pitchfork has uploaded a video of them in concert. They're very interesting. I think.
Yes.
I am happy that these. I think that the 90s were a very interesting time. I mean politically also, but what I think about the 90s is that on the other hand, what I would have liked was that the left libertarian alliance to make their place. But I some who could later. I mean, I don't know if you know. I know the Greens consider several names, and that actually Nader wasn't the first, and that they're considered other names. I don't know if you know which were the candidates that they considered to draft before Nader.
You mean in '96, or do you mean in previous elections? There were different groups that were calling themselves a Green Party, so it gets tricky. I don't know the history of the '96 nomination process. I thought in 1992 they had backed Ron Daniels, but then I looked that up recently, and it was some other party, and maybe it was cross-endorsed by one of the Green, proto-party groupings. But it's interesting to hear about like the '90s in Peru, though, because in the U.S., of course, that's our period that's after the Cold War and before the War on Terror. And you just have a different culture then. I remember.
Yes, I mean, the funny thing. Well, Peru, obviously, the Shining Path and the revolutionary movement, Tupac Amaru, they were more or less Marxist guerrilla. You could say fairly they were terrorism. The funny part was that actually it was the anarchists which make a case for opposing both the right wing government and also the Marxist guerrillas, and it was very interesting because there was a concert.
Weren't the Shining Path like assassinating leaders in the new towns and anything that might be
actually
a different? Yeah.
They actually assassinated some left-wing Congress. No, I don't know if congressman, but city councils, things like that. So the Shining Path and Tupac Amaru were very authoritarian aspects of the left. But the funny part was that in the 80s there was rise in the anarchism, and the 90s was didn't want to be associated with the left, and so a lot of people left the anarchist movement, and it's sad because now the anarchist movement in Peru is very I don't know. I really prefer the socialists than the anarchists, because the anarchists are like a small Trotskyist cult, 2 or 4 people fighting the other group, doing much things, I think, sadly, in Peru. But it was a funny period. I think that actually the rock music became very popular here in the 90s. I mean, radios, a lot of radios even passed some alternative rock. I mean, not necessarily much states were relatively popular here, which is kind of strange. And according to a friend, which knew a New Zealand girl, something like that happened in New Zealand, where in the radio they passed some very obscure American bands. But I don't know, it was a very strange period. I mean, rock music became very popular here, and like, I don't know what happened exactly, but then like the rock scene like it started to falling apart, and now Peru is now, because of the K-pop movement, is very large. The people that listen to K-pop, and there are a lot of Korean bands that come here.
Oh, really? Korean?
Yes. Well, there is not necessarily large here. I mean, there are a lot of Chinese descendants here. I mean, if I am not wrong, Peru is the second country with more Chinese descendants. I mean, after the United States. So, but Koreans no. And actually, Koreans and Chinese have bad relations in general. But Korean music is relatively popular.
That's interesting. Well, it's after 10, so we should probably roll this up. It's been good talking to you online for a long time.
Yes.
And, good luck with the. This is the first episode, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah. So good luck with the new program, the new project.
Yes. Thanks for being here. So it will be until